I know thy works, and tribulation, and poverty, but thou art rich. Welcome to the Black Excellence and Abundance Channel. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will be taking a look at Mrs. Henrietta Lacks and the amazing legacy of the HeLa cell some 70 years after her death. Henrietta Lacks was born Loretta Pleasant on August 1st, 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia, to Eliza and Johnny Pleasant. Her family is uncertain how her name changed from Loretta to Henrietta, but she was nicknamed Henny. When Loretta was 4 years old in 1924, her mother died giving birth to her 10th child. Unable to care for the children alone after his wife's death, Loretta's father moved the family to Clover, Virginia, where the children were distributed among their relatives. Loretta ended up living with her grandfather. Like most members of her family living in Clover, Loretta worked as a tobacco farmer starting from an early age. In 1935, Henrietta and her future husband David Day had their first son Lawrence, followed in 1939 by their daughter Elsie. David Day and Henrietta were married in Halifax County, Virginia in 1941. Later that year, their cousin Fred Garrett convinced the couple to leave the tobacco farm in Virginia and move to Maryland, where Day Lacks could work at Bethlehem, Steel, and Sparrows Point. Not long after they moved to Maryland, Garrett was called to fight in World War II. With the savings gifted to him by Garrett, Day Lacks was able to purchase a house at 713 New Pittsburgh Avenue in Turner Station. Now part of Dundalk, Turner Station was one of the oldest and largest African American communities in Baltimore County at that time. Later that year, their cousin Fred Garrett convinced the couple to leave the tobacco farm in Virginia and move to Maryland, where Day Lacks could work at Bethlehem, Steel, and Sparrows Point. Not long after they moved to Maryland, Garrett was called to fight in World War II. Living in Maryland, Henrietta and Day Lacks had three more children: David Sonny Lacks Jr., born 1947, and Deborah Lacks, born 1949, and Joseph Lacks, born 1950. Henrietta gave birth to her last child at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore in November 1950, 4.5 months before she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. In 1951, the young mother of 5 visited the Johns Hopkins Hospital complaining of vaginal bleeding. Upon examination, a doctor discovered a large malignant tumor on her cervix. At the time, the Johns Hopkins Hospital was the only one of a few hospitals to treat poor African Americans. During the examination, tissue samples from her tumors were taken without consent during treatment, and these samples were subsequently cultured into the HeLa cell line. As medical records show, Mrs. Lacks began undergoing radium treatments for her cervical cancer. This was the best medical treatment available at the time for this terrible disease. A sample of her cancer cells retrieved during a biopsy were sent to a nearby tissue lab. For years, a doctor, a prominent cancer and virus researcher, had been collecting cells from all patients who came to the Johns Hopkins Hospital with cervical cancer, but each sample quickly died in the lab. It was soon discovered
that Mrs. Lack's cells were unlike any of the others he had ever seen. Where other cells would die, Mrs. Lack's cells doubled every 20 to 24 hours.
Now we must say, it's not the fact that the tissue samples were taken, but the fact that they were taken without consent for experimentation makes this a travesty of justice. Lacks was the unwitting source of these cells from a tumor biopsy during the treatment for cervical cancer at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. These cells were cultured, and ultimately, the cell line known as the HeLa cell, which is still in use for the medical research, was developed. As stated, no consent was obtained to culture these cells, nor was she or her family compensated for this extraction or use. Millions upon millions of dollars have been made off of the HeLa cell line. And her or her family has received very little, if any, compensation.
Even though some information about the origins of HeLa's immortalized cell lines was known to researchers after 1970, the Lacks family was not made aware of the line's existence until 1975. With knowledge of the cell line's genetic provenance becoming public, its use for medical research and for commercial purposes continues to raise concerns about privacy and patients' rights.
Although, when you check the history and when you look at the documentation surrounding this case, you will find certain doctors who take credit for discovering and creating the HeLa cell line. No one takes responsibility for taking these cells and using them without consent. No one. Today, these incredible cells, nicknamed HeLa cells, from the first two letters of her first and last names, are used to study the effects of toxins, drugs, hormones, and viruses on the growth of cancer cells without experimenting on humans. They have been used to test the effects of radiations and poisons, to study the human genomes, and to learn more about how viruses work. And they play a critical role in the development of polio vaccines. Although Mrs. Lacks ultimately passed away on October 4th, 1951, at the age of 31, her cells continue to this day to impact the entire world, almost 70 years after her passing. Looking at the Henrietta Lacks case and the miracle of her HeLa cell, I cannot help but think about all the other research that have been conducted on enslaved women, men, women, boys, and girls, and even babies, without consent. And no telling how many other cases like this have gone under the radar. And let's not forget about the Tuskegee experiment, where they injected black men with syphilis that went untreated just to see the effects that it would have on those unfortunate souls. It even makes me think about gator bait and how they took our babies and fed them to alligators just to get the alligator's skin. During the Tuskegee experiment, they recruited these unsuspecting black men just to see the effects of syphilis. It was presented to them as if it was some type of honor, yet they had devious intentions, and the syphilis never was treated. How could you be so cruel? This is the end result of the Tuskegee experiment. What a shame. This is why many black people in this country do not trust the establishment to be honorable in anything that they present to us. Any type of vaccine, any type of situation where you're presented with some type of new treatment. Me personally, I definitely would not be a willing participant. Don't do it. These families were never compensated. They were never given justice. And you say that black people don't deserve reparations? Yeah, right. We will never forget the gator baits, using black babies to catch alligators. Babies, y'all. Babies. And to many white people, this was nothing more than a sick joke, which they turned into a business. And they made millions. Another terrible tragedy was the eugenics movement, which later became the Planned Parenthood, which sole purpose was to abort unknowing babies and sterilize black women. Ladies and gentlemen, this went on throughout the country. This was not an isolated incident. The funny thing about it, no matter how many experiments and how devious their intention, the Most High has always had his hand on us and we have always multiplied. Thank God. Now, when we look at the current situation with the COVID-19 and how all of a sudden the black community has become the face of this disease, I look at this with suspicion because depending on which state you go to, you will see that the numbers for black people are very, very low. However, the media is not talking about states like Colorado and California and Massachusetts and so many others where the numbers for the black community is very, very low. Somehow you only hear about the states where the black community, where the numbers are high. I have to look at this with suspicion. I don't believe it. Particularly when you consider that the hospitals are giving white patients preferential treatment when it comes to the COVID-19. It's no wonder that our numbers are a bit higher. And also consider that many of the black people who are getting COVID-19 are the ones who are on the front line, the essential workers. So I caution you, please do not take these vaccines. All of a sudden, we are the face of this disease. When reality, when you look at places like Hong Kong, China, France, Germany, Italy, that's where the disease is completely out of control. Before you come trying to give us that vaccine, you try it over there and see how that works out. I completely reject the notion that we are the face of this disease. There's also an abundance of material in the Southern medical journals that reveal that slaves had a significant role in medical education and in experimental and radical medical and surgical practice of the antebellum South. And further investigation into this subject indicates that Southern white medical educators and researchers relied greatly on the availability of Negro patients for various purposes. Black bodies often found their way to dissecting tables, operating amphitheaters, classroom or bedroom demonstrations, and experimental facilities. Now back to the amazing story of Miss Henrietta Lacks.
How much are the HeLa cells worth? They were the first cells ever commercialized, and that was in the 1950s. You know, you can buy online HeLa cells or products made from HeLa cells for anywhere from about $200 to about $10,000 a vial. Who owns the HeLa cells? In 2017, Johns Hopkins University released a statement denying it had profited from the cells. Johns Hopkins never patented HeLa cells and therefore does not own the rights to the HeLa cell line, the statement said.
It's funny how Johns Hopkins denies making profits on the HeLa cells, yet certain doctors want to claim credit for this invention. There is something suspicious about this, folks. I just don't trust the process.
HeLa cells are incredibly hardy, which makes them very useful for medical research. But HeLa cells were the first line of human cells to survive in vitro, in a test tube. The cells were taken from Lacks tissue samples and grown by a researcher. How are HeLa cells still alive? Immortal cells of Henrietta Lacks live on in labs. The connected pairs of HeLa cells in this slide are individual cells dividing to form two new cells in a process called mitosis. Lacks died of cancer almost 70 years ago, but her cells, taken without her knowledge or consent, are still alive today. What diseases did HeLa cells cure? HeLa cells also led to breakthroughs in the study of herpes, leukemia, influenza, hemophilia, Parkinson's disease, certain types of genetic diagnosis, cancer, AIDS, cloning, the effects of radiation and toxic substances, and in vitro fertilization. How are HeLa cells immortal? HeLa cells are immortal, meaning they will divide again and again and again. This performance can be explained by the expression of an overactive telomeres that rebuilds telomeres after each division, preventing cellular aging and cellular senescence, and allowing perpetual divisions of the cells. Before HeLa cells, scientists spent more time trying to keep cells alive than performing actual research on the cells. An endless supply of HeLa cells freed up time for discovery. In 1952, the worst year of the polio epidemic, HeLa cells were used to test the vaccine that protected millions. Some cells in Lacks tissue sample behave differently than others. Scientists learned to isolate one specific cell, multiply it, and start a cell line. Isolating one cell and keeping it alive is the basic technique for cloning and in vitro fertilization. A scientist accidentally poured a chemical on a HeLa cell that spread out its tangled chromosomes. Later on, scientists used this technique to determine that humans have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, not 48, which provided the basis for making several types of genetic diagnosis. It was discovered that Lacks cancerous cells use an enzyme called telomeres to repair their DNA, allowing them and other types of cancer cells to function when normal cells would have died. Anti-cancer drugs that work against this enzyme are currently in early clinical trials.
Ladies and gentlemen, this story is simply amazing. Just think, the cells for Miss Henrietta Lacks lives on almost 70 years since her death, and they have helped millions of people. All I could say is thank God, thank the Most High. The Black Excellence and Abundance Channel, where Black history is every day.
Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And as always,
Thou art rich.